Welcome back to the weWFM podcast, the show dedicated to exploring the cutting edge of workforce management. I'm your host, Doug Casterton, and today I'm thrilled to introduce a guest who brings a truly unique perspective to our field. Our guest today is Alex James, and his journey into workforce management is unlike anything we've featured before. Alex spent nearly 3 decades as a civil engineer, working on some of Sydney's most iconic infrastructure projects, from the Sydney Harbour Tunnel, Sydney Airport, Cross City Tunnel, and all the Sydney rail network. But here's where it gets fascinating. Alex took those complex system engineering principles and applied them to something entirely different, optimising human effort in the workplace. He's the founder and CEO of Century, where he's developed what he calls the effort management theorem, a revolutionary approach that goes far beyond traditional workforce gap calculations to actually forecast delivery outcomes, financial margins, and employee well-being. Alex isn't just theorising about this stuff. His recent work in aged care sector has uncovered some startling findings that we're going to talk about today. Beyond this work, Alex is helping to shape the future of our industry as a project leader for the ISO standard, developing international standards for workforce allocation. What makes today's conversation particularly exciting is that Alex is applying workforce management principles well outside the contact centre into aged care, project-based organisations and government agencies, proving that the challenges we face in workforce optimisation are truly universal. Alex, absolutely overjoyed to have you on the weWFM podcast today. I think it's been a long time coming. We actually met 2-3 weeks ago in Sydney, where you talking about some of the things that you've been up to. It's great to have you. Welcome on the weWFM podcast.
Well, thanks, Doug, for having me. I feel very flattered. You're a thought leader in this WFM space. I really do hope I can contribute to this great thought leadership that you have and the other people you have on the show.
What's really fascinating for me is that workforce management is often talked about in the contact center space, but of course, you're coming at from a different angle and applying many of the principles that have been applied in contact center, but outside of that in different industries, which I think will make a fascinating episode. And of course, some of the things that you've been doing to really push the boundaries, I think, are going to be super interesting for our listeners.
Yeah, thanks. I think that the cross-pollination, you probably talk about workforce management a lot in contact centers, but there is a whole world in the project world, of resource management. And there are other workforce types as well that can all benefit from each other and take a master view on what is good workforce management.
Yeah. And also as well, we always try to find out a little bit about the people we have on the weWFM podcast, their background and career. When I was doing my research on you, I think it was the first time that I've come across somebody that's come with the background that you have, which is definitely very interesting. You've had a fantastic career transition from design and construction of major infrastructures like the Sydney Harbour Tunnel, which I'd love to hear a bit more about. What parallels do you see in that engineering complex infrastructure systems that you've managed to then bring into complex workforce management systems? And what inspired you to make the shift?
Yeah, so to say that I worked on Harbour Tunnel is a true fact, but anyone in Sydney would know that would really date me as a whippersnapper cadet engineer when that was built in the late 80s, early 90s. I can speak to infrastructure engineering and transport and delivery to a degree. The reason I got into workforce management is that through my years in construction and consulting, I saw the carnage of poor resource management. And, for want of adding up some numbers and comparing them, as simple as it sounds, I felt a lot of pain could have been avoided. Over about 10 years ago, I saw a pattern in some resource management work in my PMO. From that, I came to a few conclusions and started building a resource management solution for project-based organizations. Wow. During that, I also had some deeper insights into what I call effort management, which we'll talk about. That's applicable to all workforce types. And I feel it's something that could be brought to the industry and to market, and was kind of in a learning phase at the moment, but it's based on some pretty fundamental principles that I'm always keen for your view on, Doug. And every time I explain it, I get a different response from people. In regard to the parallels between engineering and workforce management, I think you touched on it. It starts with complexity. Complexity is common to both. And from the outside, from those who aren't in it, it could appear quite chaotic because there's so many numbers and it's just really tough to wrangle these things. Both operate in systems in which, if the system is not managed well, it can get out of hand quickly and generate inefficiencies. And we strive to wrangle this complexity. Now, digital tech can hold this information and almost model it to a level that humans can't. I think it's only with this recent adoption of technology that we actually have the tools to do it. But there's still also some fundamental underlying principles that I think have probably been wanting until now. Both sectors have been improving in engineering. Project controls and BIM modeling have come a long way in the last 10 or 20 years, I can see, as has workforce management, which I think rostering was one of the first applications of computing. But I have seen the progression in consultancies with professional services, automation, and others. So there is a march towards better, which both have occurred. But there's also adoption challenges. I was only in recent memory that I know of billion-dollar projects that have been not managed well with advanced scheduling, or who users earn value. It's been around for 40 years. These types of paradigms, problems, and I suspect the same for workforce management, particularly as you try to push workforce management into sectors that are less mature outside of contact centers, which I consider really mature. There is a paradigm shift of ways to do things that are a challenge for both engineering and workforce management.
Well, so that's Alex. That's really interesting, and I know that that's then taking you into other directions. You've developed what you call the effort management theorem, and created a company that is providing that effort management analysis. Can you walk us through this methodology and explain how it goes beyond traditional workforce gap calculations to forecast outcomes and efficiencies? I think this is a super interesting product that you developed.
Yeah, thanks. So maybe I should have got a camera with a piece of paper to draw it, but I think your listeners will get it. I'll start with what, and then probably it's important to go to the why. Essentially, effort management theory is based around the fact that there are three types of effort: how many people you need, how many people you have, and how many people you use, commonly known as demand, capacity, and allocation. That was my epiphany a long time ago, that there are three types of effort. The theorem says that when you compare these three, you can forecast three types of outcomes. You can forecast an ability to deliver, forecast an efficiency of the workforce, you forecast the intensity that people can work. So ability, efficiency, and intensity. You might think of these as productivities. You can typically calculate a gap between one or two of these, very rarely all three. Effort management actually calculates the ratio. So ability is capacity divided by demand. I've got 80 people, I need 100, I'm going to deliver about 80%. Efficiency is allocation divided by capacity. So I've allocated 60 people, I've got 80, therefore we're going to be 75% utilized or efficient. And the last one is demand divided by allocation. If I need 100 and I divide by 60 people, to do that work, people are going to have to work 66% faster. It's 166. So there are three ratios. When you invert these, there's actually six ratios. And when you compare them, you can calculate inefficiencies. Step three is we can translate these inefficiencies into forecasts of how much we're going to be able to deliver, of financial margins, or even working on people's well-being. There's three types of results. To go from an allocation of one person all the way to results, there's 5 levels of abstraction. There's the real allocation and demand numbers that we convert into effort profiles. We convert that into outcomes, into inefficiencies, and into results. This is one of the first times where there's a direct relationship between physical data and hard results. Inefficiencies are probably the heart of it. In workforce management, we have workforce planning and workforce allocation processes. And when we don't plan well, we end up with a deficit or surplus in people in a group. When we don't allocate well, we either under or over allocate. So the two processes, and they both have two forms of inefficiencies. But when I say over allocate or under allocate, what does that mean to you?
To me, so you're talking about the actual workloads being assigned to the employee. Under allocating would be somebody that's overworked or underworked in terms of their capacity to, I assume, Alice.
And that's fair enough. But I would also suggest that you could use that term under or over allocate. The job was under allocated or over allocated.
But in hand.
I started off with workforce planning, workforce allocation comparisons. But what I'm coming to is it's actually a third comparison, which brings us back to the fact that there are three outcomes. Typically, people doing workforce allocation will just compare allocation and the demand and say, I've got enough people on it. But did you have enough people to allocate in the first place? And what is the relationship between demand and the capacity? There are three inputs, three ratios. And then actually if you then apply the ideas of stretch, if you apply the ideas of cap, there are about 60 permutations to inefficiencies that can be generated. The beauty of inefficiencies in effort management is that when you get them to the smallest group, like nurses on a shift in an aged care facility, and you calculate these inefficiencies, you can aggregate these inefficiencies up for all nurses in the roster. You can work out a number that represents the effectiveness of nurses across the whole roster period, or all nurses across multiple facilities, or all staff across the whole organization of maybe 20 facilities, and present that one number of effectiveness to an executive and put them on a table and saying, next week, we're going to be this effective. And they'll go, and we had this case. We said, you look like you're 80% effective. And the CFO said, I want 95%. And we said, that's fine.
I think it's the first time that I've come across something that has brought it to a single number. Often half the problem with scheduling efficiency is that you end up with disparate numbers. You get lost in the woods and never represent that single number. So yeah, that's definitely a game changer. Very interesting.
This plays into why we do this. As we said before, workforce management is a system. In systems, you have frameworks, governance, training, and ultimately look for continuous improvement. There's that old saying, if you want to improve something, you should be able to measure it. The other type of resource that organizations have are financial resources. And they've got a system for managing financial resources that's thousands of years old called accounting. And they can forecast the yield on capital invested. We don't have any measures in workforce management other than a gap. And Doug, a gap for me doesn't answer, or for managers, doesn't answer the three fundamental questions that are in their mind every day when they come to work, which is, are we going to be able to deliver? Are we going to be profitable? And are our people going to be okay? For me, these are these are asking questions. So the three criteria of an organization's success.
I love the fact that you've got those three dimensions, particularly the employee side of things, because I think that often gets forgotten and has that effect of affecting all the other metrics. If you overwork your people, then you're also going to pay in terms of cost, because maybe they're going to go sick more or leave the business, and you're going to have the cost of replacement. It's great that you've got those three dimensions. Often it's focused on a singular direction in terms of just cost, but that's not necessarily the full picture.
If I can unpack that three-dimensional piece a little bit more, one of the simple but astounding facts is that if you multiply ability times intensity times efficiency, the three outcomes, the simple maths works out that they will always equal 1. Ability times efficiency times intensity equals 1. Any configuration of it. And what that means is that you can describe the workforce's effectiveness in a three-dimensional position. It's a value of three-dimensional position. And what we typically do is think about, in workforce planning, what's the difference between demand and capacity, by looking at two sides of that three-dimensional prism. You can look at any of those three outcomes from three perspectives, literally. And this is actually a really powerful thing that goes on to help, with some of the analysis and the maths we've applied. The other side to this is if you take the scenario where there is a shortage in workers, there are 3 scenarios that can occur. This is the most fundamental part to effort management. The first scenario is, okay, we needed 100, we've only got 80, we're going to deliver 80%. So you under-deliver. If people work the same amount of duration and they work at the same pace or intensity. So that's scenario 1, you under-deliver, same pace, same intensity. Scenario 2 is you do deliver, but by making people work longer at the same pace. Scenario 3 is you deliver, people working for the same amount of time, but in that time working faster. And the fourth scenario is actually a compromise of all those 3. And I think that's actually the most common thing. You'll cut a little bit of corner on the quality. You might work a little bit longer.
Yeah, exactly.
I think the maths is super simple, but I don't think managers have this in their head. Just to understand this model and framework of what they're doing with their workers, even without any modeling, is quite enlightening and helpful to understand this conversation that everyone has from different perspectives about the delivery of money and people's well-being.
When we were talking about the types of industries that you are focusing on, where have you found your niche in terms of the clients that you typically look to help?
I did start out thinking that I could apply these great ideas in engineering and project controls. And in fact, for a couple of years, I had a big US corporation promising to trial it, but that didn't pan out. And what we've ended up doing is going to the other end of the spectrum and trialing and applying effort management in aged care in Australia. Instead of having 1,500 engineers, we had 100 people on a 2-week roster. And what we've found quite incredibly consistently across all the facilities that we applied the analysis to was exhaustion in the staff and the admins and the managers trying to do this tricky rostering thing. And they were using best practice tools, including Kronos, UKG. Consistently, we found a number of causes generating inefficiency. The inefficiencies were 20%. So there was 80% effectiveness. Some were 90, some were 75. And this represented $10 to $15 a day per resident, which with a very tight margin business was actually 2 or 3 times their target margins. The value of a 20% inefficiency can swamp profit margins. What was causing this? The biggest one was that more than half of that 20% shortage could have been filled by workers that didn't get rostered and were sitting at home waiting for a call. And then what happens? They have a gap and they're obliged to fill these gaps with very expensive agency workers. So it becomes very expensive. And that was probably the most startling finding that we had. But there was also a number of shifts where there was an over allocation of carers, shifts where people were being assigned when no one was available. Then you were having bouts of extreme overtime. Some people double shifting on several days. And it's funny how it is the same staff member. So you've got to wonder what's going on with the relationship between that worker and the roster clerk, perhaps. All in all, it was adding up to this value of 2 or 3 times. And, for a $200 million business that was actually turnover business is actually going backwards, the value of the inefficiencies was in the order of $8 million.
It's fascinating to see, like you say, you've got a fairly established team doing the schedule. They've got a pretty good piece of kit to produce that schedule.
Yeah.
But going back to what we said earlier around not being able to see the wood from the trees, I think that sums up exactly what is missing, which is often that 3-dimensional analysis that allows you to really look at it. And now suddenly you can see the trees in the woods. I think that's a definite move forward. Very fascinating.
You've got that measuring stick. And the first time I presented this to a large aged care provider, I had 3 executives with their heads in their hands, shaking their heads. And then a little bit of the blame kicked in, why aren't these people doing their job? Well, it was 5 different facilities with 5 different roster clerks were all doing the same thing. Is that their problem or perhaps yours?
It's just, yeah, very true. So, I mean, talking about some of the other things that you've done in your career as well, I know that prior to, well, was it prior or was it concurrently at the same time? You were also project leader for the ISO TC 260 WG4, developing international standards for allocation management. You were helping to define those global best practices. How did that come about? And what were the key elements that you felt that organizations were missing from their current workforce planning approaches?
Well, you would know that came about thanks to our mutual acquaintance, Julie Sloan.
Julie Sloan, yes. Yeah.
Julie Sloan, Australian person who started, I think, is MB 009 in Standards Australia, which engages with the ISO standards. When I was doing my initial resource management solution, she saw that and asked me to join. And I did. Julie's since left, but shout out to Julie. She was the creator of one of these first standards. So there is a question of why the heck is HR getting involved in workforce management standards? And admittedly, this is a great topic, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Before I arrived, Julie and the international team had created one of two standards. So there's a workforce planning standard, ISO 30409, and I subsequently got involved with a second standard for workforce allocation, ISO 30434, which was published in mid-23. And I think that's how we first got connected.
You reached out.
Looking for world experts to contribute to that. There is a need for standards. My subsequent work has shown that in aged care, what was missing is not just the fact that the roster clients were not doing the right optimized thing, but there wasn't a system to help guide them and ensure that the system of workforce management was working. Because as you said, it is a system, and there's governance and responsibility and quality. We come to this improve and, my thesis, measure. That's now out. The team was so exhausted by it, we've not actually gone and really published and promoted it as much as it should be, but that is coming. Also, it's coming on the back of, even in TC 260, there was the question as to what is HR's role in organizing work and workers. Back in late 23, they set up a working group to explore this question. We went on to create a survey that we published to the HR community and others. And it was a modest survey with the results. Actually, right at the moment, Doug, I'm working on documenting that and publishing on the worksite. And it will remain open. So any of your listeners, maybe we could drop that in as a link. But that process did validate the question of what is HR's role. The punchline is that there's a lot more activity in organizing work and workers by HR than a lot of people understand. Hopefully in a month or two, we'll be publishing the results.
I always find it interesting how the setups and cohorts of people that are doing workforce management. So I don't know if you've found similar kind of synergies as you work through the standards, that you actually found that regardless of whether it's applying in a project space or a healthcare situation or in a contact center, actually a lot of the principles are very similar, or do you find that they're very different?
If you read the standard, it's very generic. There's no one sector. There's some very fundamental elements to it. So one of the ideas that the standard, that it sets up a framework, but it also talks about the fact that there are levels of allocation. You go from planning down to a point where you might be applying at one level, you're putting someone on a roster, but above that, there was how did they get to that ward maybe, and how did they get to that facility, and you stretch back up.
Yeah.
And it's a continuous process, and we had this discussion in airlines, on ground handling crew, in hotels, in project space. The group of us realized that there was this hierarchy, and it almost becomes the point where planning and allocation are combined together. And that's universal across all sectors.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating and long overdue as well, because we've been talking about workforce planning, resource manager, whatever you want to call it, for more than 2 decades, probably coming up to 3 decades. And yet there's never really been that standard for best practice. You've got it in every other function and discipline, or, like finance or HR. But when it comes to workforce management, there's been nothing. Everybody's been trying to figure out what best practice is.
I hope we've got a start,
Yeah,
Don't
exactly.
pretend to be the panacea to everything, but we've made a start with the standard. And going back to, there are horses for courses. So, we've talked about in contact centers, I've not really pushed the contact centers because I've assumed that it's so mature that there are no inefficiencies left. And then it's a perfect world and everyone's really happy because it's all so well organized. I kind of carried that into rostering workforces, and the simplest rostering workforce in the world, which is aged care. And we found there is a degree of inefficiency that could be improved. So if you take that really simple example and then go to something like project-based, I've had experience with large technical teams with 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 digital professionals or engineering professionals. Imagine the inefficiency in those, where they've got silos, they're scattered across the country. In fact, we already have some results. They are less than 80% effective. They have a massive opportunity to transfer deficits and surpluses between different teams.
From somebody now that is in this situation where perhaps can't see the wood from the trees, maybe drowning in spreadsheets, trying to decipher whether or not they're doing a good job on the scheduling, what would you say are the first steps, other than obviously taking your product that gets them there straight away? But what would you say the first steps would be to take towards understanding the particular situation a bit better?
Before coming to me for my tool analysis, I'd be very happy for the world to understand the fundamentals around what I call the effort management theorem, that there are three types of effort, three core outcomes, over 20 inefficiencies and over 60 combinations. But I have to know all that. But the name of the game, when those three effort profiles are not the same, your workforce is not fully 100% efficient. But the name of the game is to bring them together. And when those three effort profiles are the same, then only then can you say that your workforce is optimized. The tank,
Like that.
just do whatever you need to get to that or get those closer and understand those numbers. And then as you try to get closer and closer, you've got to work harder and harder. And that's where going beyond gaps and into forecasting effectiveness and having those measures would apply. The brand of effort management is called Sentry. If people are interested in what we do is firstly understand the workforce. If the data's there and the workforce is effective, not all workforces need this. I don't believe workforces that are not constrained. It's when you have to deliver and have a limited workforce, then you've got a problem. So that's the first test. Do you have to deliver and do you have some sort of constrained workforce? Can you describe digitally how many people you need? It doesn't have to be structured data. Do you have it? So what we do is offer a translation of that need to have and use data. A second step would be to provide a snapshot of your effectiveness now, so you can see where you're at. And if this is something that you want to continue to embed in your workflow for your workforce management, we could take a third step and provide it on a routine basis.
I know you do that translation bit because we've talked about it before. I'm pretty sure you've seen some wonderful different creations that you've had to translate into numbers.
I've translated a published roster in PDF.
Kudos to you being able to translate that. That's achievement. I'd like to wrap up with a look forwards into the industry if you're able to peer forward. Although interesting times at the moment because things are changing so quick. But looking ahead, where do you see workforce analytics heading in the next 5 to 10 years? And then with your engineering background and that deep workforce expertise that we were describing earlier, what emerging technologies or methodologies do you think will be game changers for how organizations manage human effort going forward?
Yeah. So I find it really interesting that you use the term workforce analytics.
Right.
Is workforce management a subset of that? I don't know if you mean that. Specifically, in ISO world, one of TC26's great successes has been a standard for workforce analytics called human capital reporting, ISO 304-414. And credit to Neil McCormick, an Australian, who has driven that standard with people in the United States, Canada, and Europe. That's our most successful standard. It's having world impact. I was in Japan at a plenary and a dozen Japanese corporates got up. I couldn't read Japanese and I couldn't hear it, but I did see ISO 414
Wow.
being presented, and they, the Japanese are grabbing it.
That must have been a cool moment.
It was, I think everyone was very pleased to see that at least Japan is moving, and slowly other countries are taking it on. And it's a slow journey. That's specifically for workforce analytics around retention rates and education rates and those sorts of things. In terms of workforce management, from the technology point of view, there will be more generation and adoption based on technology. And I think a lot of that optimization is going to increase, and even at the deterministic level. I think people are getting cleverer of how to do deterministic optimization, let alone the obvious coming of AI.
We nearly got through a whole episode without mentioning AI. So, but you can't, can you? It's impossible.
You asked about the future. Have you seen AI used for assigning people to tasks?
I've seen a couple of tools that are doing it on a real-time basis, or doing adjustments and reallocation in real time, adjusting to workflow. In terms of the sort of upfront side, not so much, no. And that real-time solutions that I mentioned are not widely adopted. They're still trying to break open that segment.
So I think, in terms of technology, there's going to be this incremental improvement in the mature sectors. But I think also if the less mature sectors, like in the project-based world, government agencies or a defense, it goes on and on, there's a limitless number, that you're going to see bigger steps as there's this continual push to do better, push that comes from hard dollars, and then a little bit of what I feel is at the moment a bit tokenistic well-being, being something more than just a little bit of resilience training. There's two avenues. The existing tech will get better and those very tight inefficiencies will shrink. Other sectors will take bigger steps into. But what I think should happen is that the effort management theorem should go mainstream. I think managers understanding that it wouldn't be a dream if it were taught in an MBA or something. And such that my whole purpose is that when a manager walks up to someone at a desk, or these days probably types something in Teams chat and says, "Can you go do this job?" They know, they have an obligation to know that that job can be achieved and the person can do it without being overworked. At the moment, there's this sense of reasonableness, or just get the job done. It's all in a manager's head. It's all qualitative, and I call it management by hope. I would like to see managers have the tools and the knowledge, which the computer can now provide, so that there is a comfort and a certainty that what's being asked is reasonable. Because I think ultimately, the inefficiencies in industry are absolutely massive, Doug. That's my read on the few tests we've made so far. If the inefficiencies are massive and they're solvable, then so are the potential results.
Yeah.
It could be an absolute boon. And I think this area might be one of the last untapped fields of productivity improvement in industry.
I think you might be true. And it's good that you touch upon that maturity level, because you'll find maturity levels in context, as you were mentioning about them. Surely they've got that sorted after 30 years. And you're finding plenty of situations where it's not the case. I think in industry perspective, there's different segments are still catching up and are going to make those big leaps. Really great point. And a lovely way to end it as well. I think that's a great glimpse into the future. Alex, thank you very much for joining us on the weWFM podcast. Really fascinating.
Thank you.
It's great to hear the things that you're getting up to. You're one of the industry leaders in terms of pushing the boundaries, not only from the standards, but also looking at different dimensions and helping us see in that three-dimensional view. Alex, real pleasure speaking to you, and thank you for your time.
Well, likewise, Doug, it's been a privilege being on this, to have someone like yourself hear me out and support these initiatives. It's fantastic. I really enjoyed it, and I look forward to catching up with you.